It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Is that a knockoff? Julian Thorne sneered, fingering Elena Thorne's collar in front of the dinner guests. He didn't wait for an answer, his laugh barking loud and jagged against the vaulted ceiling of the estate's dining room. He turned to the woman beside him, a socialite draped in more sequins than taste. My sister has a talent for looking like she's about to ask for a manager at a discount store, doesn't she? The table erupted in polite, cruel titters. Elena felt the heat of 30 pairs of eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her spine a straight line of tempered steel beneath her unbranded, bespoke wool dress. The fabric was Italian silk blend, hand-stitched and worth more than the flashy velvet blazer Julian was currently sweating through, but he wouldn't know that. He only recognized logos that screamed for attention. "Julian, don't be boorish," Beatrice Thorne said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes as she adjusted a diamond necklace that looked heavy enough to choke her. She glanced at her daughter with a flicker of genuine distaste. "Elena, you really could have tried harder for your brother's big night. First impressions are everything in this circle." "I apologize if my presence is an eyesore, Mother," Elena said, her voice a calm, low melody that cut through the chatter. She picked up her water glass, the condensation cold against her steady fingers. "I thought the focus tonight was on Julian's achievement." "Exactly," Marcus Thorne boomed from the head of the table. He raised a vintage crystal flute, the amber liquid inside catching the light of the chandelier. "To the Thorne Heights project, the most ambitious architectural feat this family has ever seen, and to the man who dreamed it all up, my son, Julian." Elena watched as Julian puffed out his chest, the gold links of his Patek Philippe watch clinking against the mahogany table as he basked in the applause. Behind him, on a high-definition screen, the blueprints for the project were displayed. Elena knew every line on that screen. She knew the weight-bearing capacity of the cantilevered glass balconies. She knew the exact thermal coefficient of the sustainable cladding. She knew them because she had spent 6 months of sleepless nights designing them in her cramped apartment, while Julian was out blowing the family's dwindling liquid assets on vintage sports cars and champagne service. She looked at her father. Marcus was beaming, the pride in his eyes as thick as the lies he was telling. He had walked into Elena's office 3 days ago, taken the physical files for a routine audit, and had disappeared until this morning. "The vision was simple," Julian said, standing up and leaning over the table, invading the space of the guests with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. "I wanted to create something that spoke to the future, something bold, something that says Thorne to the entire world." "It's a masterpiece, Julian," one of the board members remarked, leaning in. "The way the North Wing catches the light. How did you come up with that?" Julian waved a dismissive hand. "It just came to me." Genius usually does. Elena felt a sharp pinch in her palm. Her nails were digging into her skin, the only outward sign of the storm brewing beneath her ribs. She reached into her small, structured handbag and felt the smooth glass of her phone. With a silent, practiced motion, she tapped the screen. "Father," Elena said, her voice cutting through Julian's rambling explanation of his creative process. "I noticed the signature on the final filing for the city council. It looked a bit different than the preliminary drafts." The table went quiet. Marcus's hand stilled on his glass. He didn't look at her, he looked at the guest to his left. "Now isn't the time for technicalities, Elena. We're celebrating." "I just thought it was interesting," she continued, her tone conversational, almost light. "Since Julian was in Cabo during the final structural revisions, I wondered who handled the certification." Beatrice gave a sharp, brittle laugh. "Elena, dear, your jealousy is showing. Just because you're a junior architect doesn't mean you have to nitpick your brother's success." "I'm not jealous, Mother, I'm observant." Elena leaned back, her eyes locking onto Julian's. He was glaring at her, a vein pulsing in his forehead. "It's a beautiful design. It would be a shame if anything complicated the ownership of the intellectual property." Julian leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Listen to me, you little charity case. You're here because we let you be here. You work for the family firm because Dad felt sorry for you. Don't think for a second that your name belongs anywhere near a project of this scale. You're a footnote. Stay in your lane." Elena didn't blink. She reached out and adjusted the napkin on the table, her fingers brushing the edge of her phone where it lay hidden, recording every word. "You're right, Julian," she said, a small, chilling smile touching her lips. "I should remember exactly where I stand." She stood up, the movement fluid and silent. She didn't wait for a dismissal. She didn't look at the shocked faces of the guests or the simmering rage in her father's eyes. "Enjoy the celebration," Elena said. "It's a night you'll all remember." She walked out of the dining room, the sound of her heels on the marble floor rhythmic and predatory. As she stepped into the cool night air of the foyer, she pulled her phone from her bag and stopped the recording. A shadow moved near the entrance. Silas Vance stepped out from the library, his coat already on, his expression as unreadable as a ledger. He held out a folder, the real one, the one Marcus thought he had shredded. "Did you get it?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble. Elena looked back at the closed doors of the dining room, where the sound of Julian's laughter was starting up again, louder and more arrogant than before. "I got everything," Elena said, her voice as cold as the stars above the estate. "Call the auditors. Tell them we start with the offshore accounts first." She walked past him toward the waiting car, her mind already 3 moves ahead. They thought they had buried her in the fine print. They didn't realize she was the one who wrote it. The next morning, the scent of expensive, dark-roasted Arabica coffee filled the Thorne breakfast room, a space of cold marble and even colder intentions. Sunlight hit the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the table. Julian Thorne sat at the head, his new gold watch catching the light as he gestured wildly with a piece of artisanal sourdough. He was loud, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who had never seen a bank statement he couldn't manipulate. Marcus Thorne looked up from his tablet, a rare, approving smile touching his lips. "The merger is the talk of the town, Julian. You've done well to secure the Thorne legacy." "It's just the beginning, Dad," Julian said, his eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. He turned his gaze toward the doorway as Elena Thorne entered. She moved with a silent, methodical grace, her charcoal suit pressed but unremarkable. She looked like a shadow in a room built for peacocks. "Ah, the junior architect joins us," Julian sneered, leaning back in his chair. He tapped the face of his watch, a limited edition piece that cost more than Elena's annual salary. "Still wearing that old thing." "It's a bit depressing, Elena. You look like you're heading to a funeral instead of the most successful family firm in the city." Beatrice Thorne didn't look up from her grapefruit, her silver spoon clinking rhythmically against the bone china. "Don't be cruel, Julian. Your sister has always preferred utility over style. It's why she's so good at the tedious parts of the business." Elena sat down, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She felt the cold weight of the encrypted thumb drive in her pocket, a silent weapon she had spent the dawn hours discussing with Silas Vance. While her family celebrated a victory built on her stolen blueprints, she was watching the foundations of their arrogance crumble. Silas had confirmed it. Julian hadn't just forged her signature on the deed. He had used her personal credit line to fund his failing offshore tech startup. "I'm glad you're happy with the progress, Julian," she said, her voice calm and level. She reached for the silver coffee carafe, her hand steady. "The Legacy Gala is on Friday, isn't it?" 3 days away, Marcus interjected, his tone authoritative. "The board will be there. The mayor will be there. It's the official passing of the torch. Julian, you'll be giving the keynote address. Elena, I expect you to handle the logistical details. See to it that the seating chart reflects our most important donors." Julian laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Make sure she's stationed near the service entrance, Dad. She's got a talent for blending into the background. Besides, she can keep an eye on the catering staff. It's more her speed than the boardroom. Oh, and I trimmed the fat on those blueprints you were whining about, Elena. We saved 20% on the structural steel. The investors loved the margins." The air in the room seemed to thin. Elena's fingers tightened around her coffee cup, the heat of the porcelain seeping into her skin. He wasn't just stealing her work. He was compromising the safety of the entire project for a better year-end bonus. Sophia Reed moved silently around the table, pouring fresh juice. Her eyes met Elena's for a fleeting second. In that look, there was a lifetime of shared secrets and observed injustices. Sophia had seen Julian steal the files from Elena's desk. She had heard Marcus coaching him on how to lie to the auditors. The housekeeper's hand trembled slightly as she served him, but her face remained as stoic as Elena's. "I'll make sure everything is exactly where it belongs," Elena replied, her gaze meeting Julian's. He didn't notice the steel in her eyes. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the polished surface of a silver serving tray. "Good. And don't forget to park that rusted-out sedan of yours around the block. We have a reputation to maintain, and luxury doesn't mean looking like a charity case." He stood up, tossing his silk napkin onto the table with a flourish. "I have a meeting with the venture capitalists. They're ready to dump another $10 million into the tech fund. By Friday, I'll be the youngest billionaire in the state." As he swaggered out of the room, Marcus and Beatrice followed him like acolytes, leaving her alone in the silence of the marble room. Elena pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped a single command. A message appeared from Sila's, audit complete. "The shell company is a ghost. He's walking into a vacuum." She stood, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the floor, a rhythmic, predatory sound. The countdown had begun. 72 hours until the Thorne Legacy Gala. 72 hours until the torch didn't just pass, it burned the whole house down. The following afternoon, the air in Silas Vance's private office was thick with the scent of ozone and bitter espresso. Elena Thorne sat perfectly still, her spine a straight line of controlled fury, as she watched the forensic accountant tap a rhythmic cadence against his mahogany desk. The low hum of a server rack in the corner provided the only soundtrack to the revelation unfolding on the monitors between them. Silas slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the polished surface. The weight of it felt significant, a physical manifestation of the lies that had defined her life for the last 3 years. She reached out, her fingers grazing the cool, embossed seal of the Thorne family crest. "It's all there, Elena," Silas said, his voice a low rasp. "The original land deed for the coastal development project. Your grandfather didn't just leave you a seat at the table, he left you the table itself. Marcus didn't just forge your signature on a few transfer documents. He attempted to erase your entire legal existence from the trust." She opened the envelope. The paper was thick, textured with the history of a legacy that had been stolen while she was still mourning. Her eyes tracked the elegant script of her grandfather's hand, then settled on the jagged, clumsy forgery of her own name beneath a 2019 date. At the time, she had been in a hospital bed, recovering from the accident that had claimed the only man who ever truly believed in her. "The digital trail is even more damning," Silas continued, pointing to a spreadsheet on the screen. "Julian has been using the development's equity as collateral for his failed tech ventures. He's leveraged 80% of the Thorne holdings against a ghost company that doesn't produce anything but hype. If he signs the venture capital contract on Friday, he's effectively selling land he doesn't legally own." Elena felt a cold, predatory satisfaction settle in her chest. She tucked the deed back into the envelope, the sound of the paper sliding home like a blade into a sheath. "So, he's walking into a trap of his own making. He thinks he's crowning himself king," Silas replied. "He doesn't realize he's building his throne on a sinkhole." 2 hours later, she arrived back at the Thorne Manor. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax met her in the foyer, a fragrance that always felt like a funeral for her dignity. She found Julian in the grand gallery, standing before a full-length mirror while a tailor pinned a bespoke tuxedo of midnight blue silk. Julian didn't turn around, but his smirk was visible in the glass. "There she is, the family's favorite charity case. Did you find a dress for the gala, Elena? Or are you planning to wear one of your blueprints? I hear paper is very chic this season." He laughed, the sound loud and grating against the quiet elegance of the room. He adjusted his cufflink, a massive, gaudy diamond that screamed of the new money he so desperately tried to pretend was old. "I've settled on something appropriate," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the face of his storm. "Make sure it is," Julian snapped, finally turning to face her. He stepped closer, invading her personal space with the practiced ease of a man who had never been told no. The smell of his expensive, heavy cologne was suffocating. "This gala isn't just a party. It's my coronation. The VCs are coming to see the future of the Thorne Legacy, and that future is me. I don't need you lurking in the corners looking like a reminder of a past we've outgrown." Marcus Thorne stepped into the gallery then, his presence heavy with the practiced authority of a man who had spent decades perfecting a lie. He didn't look at his daughter. He looked at Julian with a pride that was as unearned as it was blinding. "The invitations are all confirmed, Julian," Marcus said, ignoring Elena entirely. "The governor, the tech board, and the press, everything is in place. By the end of the night, the Thorne name will be synonymous with your vision." "And what about the audit?" Elena asked, her voice a soft, dangerous thread. Marcus finally turned his gaze toward her, his eyes cold and dismissive. "The audit is a formality, Elena, one you needn't concern yourself with. Your brother has handled the financials with the grace of a true leader. You would do well to learn from him instead of asking questions that are above your pay grade." "I've learned quite a bit today, actually," she replied, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag, where the deed lay hidden. Julian snorted, turning back to the mirror. "Go play with your scale models, Elena. Leave the real business to the men who actually have something to lose. And tell Sophia to have my shoes polished by tonight, the ones with the gold buckles. I want to make sure everyone sees me coming." She watched them for a moment, the father who had betrayed her and the brother who had erased her. They were so blinded by the glare of their own perceived brilliance that they couldn't see the shadows she was casting. She turned and walked toward the stairs, the rhythmic click of her heels on the marble sounding like the ticking of a clock. As she reached the landing, she pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a 3-word message to Silas. 48 hours. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. She pulled the deed from her bag and laid it on her desk, the light of the setting sun catching the gold ink of the family seal. The countdown was no longer a theory. It was a countdown to a collision. In 48 hours, Julian would stand before the most powerful people in the state and claim a kingdom that was already hers. He would sign a contract that would become his own death warrant, and Marcus would watch the house he built on forgery burn to the ground. She sat in the darkness, watching the clock on her nightstand. Every second that passed was another inch of rope they were tying around their own necks. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to scream. She just had to wait for the moment they stepped off the ledge. The Thorne Legacy Gala was 2 days away. And for the first time in 3 years, Elena Thorne felt like she was exactly where she belonged, in the driver's seat. The morning before the Thorne Legacy, Gala arrived with a deceptive, golden stillness that masked the rot beneath the family's polished exterior. Elena Thorne sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. The coffee was scorched, the bitter scent hanging heavy in the air, but she didn't mind the sharp taste. It matched the clarity of her focus. The heavy thud of designer loafers echoed against the marble hallway before Julian Thorne sauntered into the room. He was already dressed in a silk robe that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. He didn't look at his sister. He looked at his reflection in the glass of the china cabinet, adjusting his hair with a smirk. "Make yourself useful, Elena," he said, his voice thick with the entitlement that had been nurtured since birth. He gestured vaguely toward the silver carafe. "Pour me a cup, and make sure it's hot this time. I have a $1 billion legacy to claim tomorrow, and I can't be slowed down by lukewarm service." Elena didn't move. She watched him, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. "The contract you're so eager to sign, Julian, have you actually read the underlying deeds? Or are you just looking for the line where you get to play king?" He let out a sharp, condescending bark of laughter, finally turning to face her. I don't need to read the fine print. That's what lawyers are for. Besides, Dad handled everything. All I have to do is show up, look the part, and take what's mine. You wouldn't understand the pressure of being the face of a dynasty. You're just the girl who draws lines on paper. Sometimes the lines on the paper are the only things keeping the house from falling down, she replied, her voice low and steady. I'm giving you a choice. Don't go through with the presentation tomorrow. Tell Marcus you want to delay the signing until an independent audit is completed. If you do that, maybe you can walk away with your reputation intact. Julian leaned over the table, his shadow falling across her. He smelled of expensive cologne and arrogance. Is that a threat? From you? You've spent your whole life in my shadow, Elena. You're bitter because tomorrow I become the legend and you stay the ghost. Keep your warnings to yourself. You're lucky we're even letting you attend. Marcus Thorne entered the room then, the sound of his heavy gold signet ring rapping against the mahogany doorframe acting like a gavel. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply looked at Elena with a cold, transactional gaze. Julian is right, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble of authority. The gala is a choreographed performance. You are there to smile, to look like a supportive daughter, and to stay silent. I've spent decades building this image. I won't have you whispering doubts into your brother's ear because you're jealous of his position. I'm not jealous, Father, she said, standing slowly. The cold weight of the marble floor seemed to anchor her. I'm the only one in this room being honest with you. Beatrice Thorne drifted in behind her husband, the cloying scent of lilies following her like a funeral shroud. She adjusted the collar of Julian's robe with a doting smile, ignoring Elena entirely. Our star is going to shine so brightly tomorrow, she whispered to her son. The whole state will be watching. Sophia Reed moved silently in the background, clearing a stray plate. Her eyes met Elena's for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the storm they both knew was coming. Sophia had seen the forgeries. She had heard the late-night arguments. She was the witness they had all forgotten to silence. Elena felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, a text from Sela's Vance. The forensic trail is locked. The auditors are in position for the gala reveal. No turning back. She looked at her family, the brother who had stolen her work, the father who had forged her life away, and the mother who had watched it happen. They were so blinded by the glare of their own perceived brilliance that they couldn't see the shadow she was casting over them. I'll be at the gala, Elena said, her voice cutting through Julian's bragging. And I'll be watching very closely when you take the stage. Julian didn't even look up from his phone. Good. Maybe you'll learn something about how real power works. Elena turned and walked toward the door. She didn't need to say another word. The warning had been given, and as expected, it had been trampled under the weight of their ego. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the crisp, authentic parchment of the family deed. The countdown was nearly over. Tomorrow, the Thorne legacy wouldn't just be passed on. It would be dismantled, piece by forged piece, in front of everyone they ever sought to impress. She stepped out into the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking with a predatory rhythm. 24 hours. The stage was set, the witnesses were ready, and the only thing left was to watch Julian Thorne step into the trap he had spent 3 years building for himself. The evening of the Golden Gala had finally arrived, draped in the kind of forced opulence that only the Thorne family could stomach. Elena Thorne stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth silk of her midnight blue gown. It was a dress of quiet luxury, no loud logos, no shimmering sequins, just impeccable tailoring that whispered of a status Julian could never truly understand. The air in the room was thick, with the cloying scent of thousands of imported lilies, a fragrance so heavy it felt like it was trying to mask the rot beneath the floorboards. Julian Thorne was already at the center of the room, holding court near the fountain of flowing champagne. He looked exactly like the man he was, a loud, performative shell of a person wrapped in a tuxedo that cost more than a small car. His laughter echoed off the marble walls, sharp and grating against the soft hum of the string quartet. He was surrounded by a circle of local socialites and potential investors, his hands moving wildly as he spun tales of his supposed business genius. "Ah, look who decided to crawl out of the blueprints," Julian said, his voice cutting through the nearby conversations as he spotted her. He didn't even wait for her to reach the group before he aimed his first strike. "Elena, darling, you're late. I was just telling Marcus that we might need to hire a professional hostess if you couldn't find your way here. You look functional. Is that dress from the outlet mall?" A few of the women in his circle tittered behind their fans. Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her clutch, a silent witness to his arrogance. She met his gaze with a look of calm indifference that seemed to prick at his ego more than a shout would have. "The gala is just beginning, Julian," she said, her voice steady and low. "And I think everyone here is more interested in the Thorne legacy than my wardrobe." "The legacy is me," he snapped, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Don't forget that. Now be a dear and go find Beatrice. She's been complaining about the catering staff all night. Maybe you can help them with the appetizers. You've always had a better rapport with the help than with the board members." He turned his back on her before she could respond, a dismissal so calculated it made the blood of the nearby guests run cold with second-hand embarrassment. Elena watched him for a moment, her pulse a slow, rhythmic thrum of anticipation. He was so certain of his victory, so convinced that he had successfully buried her under the weight of his stolen glory. She moved through the crowd, the sound of her heels clicking against the polished marble like a countdown. Near the back of the room, she found Marcus Thorne standing by the tall, arched windows. Her father looked every bit the patriarch in his charcoal suit, his face a mask of stern authority. He was nursing a glass of scotch, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory focus. "You're standing in the shadows, Elena," Marcus said without looking at her. "It's a bad look for a Thorne. Julian is out there making connections, securing the family's future. You should be at his side, supporting the image we've built." "The image you built on a lie?" she asked softly. Marcus finally turned to her, his jaw tightening. "I built it on necessity. Your brother has the charisma this family needs to survive. You have the talent, yes, but talent is a silent partner. Stay in the background tonight. Don't ruin this for him with your moods. Beatrice is already on edge." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Beatrice Thorne drifted toward them, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. She didn't offer her daughter a greeting. Instead, she reached out and adjusted the strap of Elena's dress with a sharp, judgmental tug. "You look so plain, Elena," Beatrice sighed, her voice dripping with a disappointment she had spent 20 years perfecting. "In a room full of stars, you insist on being the night sky. Try to smile. People are starting to ask why the Thorne daughter looks like she's attending a funeral." "Maybe I am," Elena replied, her voice like silk over steel. Her mother rolled her eyes and turned to Marcus, immediately launching into a complaint about the temperature of the lobster bisque. They stood there, the three of them, a family held together by forged signatures and mutual resentment. Elena felt a vibration in her clutch. She stepped away, moving toward the shadows of a large floral arrangement to check her phone. It was a message from Silas Vance. "The forensic audit is complete. The link to the main server is live. I'm in position in the tech booth. Just give the word." Elena looked up, her eyes finding Silas across the room. He was dressed as one of the event's technical consultants, a headset around his neck and a tablet in his hand. He gave her a single, imperceptible nod. The secret power she held wasn't just the deed in her bag. It was the entire digital history of the Thorne family's fraud, ready to be broadcast to every screen in the ballroom. She saw Sophia read near the kitchen entrance, the housekeeper's eyes meeting hers for a brief second. Sophia looked pale but determined, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was the final piece of the puzzle, the living witness to the night Marcus had forced the pen into Elena's hand. The quartet stopped playing. The room fell into a practiced silence as the lights dimmed slightly. A spotlight hit the small stage at the far end of the ballroom, where a podium stood emblazoned with the Thorne family crest. Julian stepped onto the stage, his chest puffed out, his face beaming with the unearned confidence of a king. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming with performative warmth. Tonight is not just about the Golden Gala. It's about the future. It's about the Thorne Legacy and the incredible announcement I'm about to make regarding the ownership of our newest flagship estate. Elena felt the air in the room shift. The witnesses were all in place. The investors were leaning in. The trap was fully set, and Julian was walking into it with a smile on his face. She reached into her bag and touched the crisp edge of the parchment deed one last time. "Wait for it," she whispered to herself. Julian leaned into the microphone, his eyes finding Elena in the crowd. He gave her a small, mocking wink before addressing the room again. "Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to invite my sister, Elena, to join me on stage. After all, she's played such a supportive role in my success." The crowd began to clap, their eyes turning toward her. Elena didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the shadows and began the long walk toward the stage, her heart beating with the steady, predatory rhythm of a lion finally closing in on its prey. Julian thought he was inviting her to his coronation. He had no idea he was inviting her to his execution. Elena stepped into the glare of the spotlights, the heat of the stage lamps pressing against her skin like a physical weight. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, the air thick with the scent of lilies and Julian's cloying, expensive sandalwood cologne. He stood at the center of the stage, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke navy suit, the gold links of his watch catching the light as he gestured for her to join him. He looked every bit the visionary he pretended to be, a masterpiece of new money, performance funded entirely by the sister he treated like a ghost. "Don't be shy, Elena," he said, his voice amplified by the microphone, dripping with a condescension that made the audience chuckle. He reached out, patting her shoulder with a heavy, paternalistic hand that made her skin crawl. "My sister has been the backbone of the Thorne Legacy, mostly by making sure my coffee stayed hot and my files stayed organized while I designed the future of this city." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd. In the front row, Marcus Thorne nodded in approval, his face a mask of stern patriarchic pride. Beside him, Beatrice Thorne adjusted her diamond necklace, her eyes never leaving her son, the golden child who could do no wrong. They were all there to witness Julian's coronation, blissfully unaware that the stage was actually a scaffold. Julian handed her the sleek, silver remote for the projector. "Go ahead, Elena. Show the investors the little sketches you helped me polish. Try not to trip over the buttons." She felt the cool, hard plastic of the remote in her palm. It was a small, insignificant object, yet it held the power to dismantle a decade of lies. She didn't look at the audience. She looked at her brother, meeting his arrogant gaze with a calm that seemed to flicker for a moment, making him frown. "I think it's time everyone saw the real foundation of this project," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying without the need for the microphone. She clicked the button. The screen behind them didn't show the gleaming 3D render of the Thorne Towers. Instead, a high-resolution scan of a legal land transfer document filled the wall. The silence that followed was instantaneous, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the ballroom. In the center of the screen, 2 signatures were magnified to 10 times their original size. On the left was Elena's actual signature from her passport. On the right was the signature on the deed that had transferred her inheritance to Julian. Even a child could see the shaky, forced lines of the forgery. Below it, a forensic audit report appeared, highlighting the trail of embezzled funds moving from Elena's trust into Julian's private offshore accounts. Julian's expression didn't just change, it disintegrated. The smug, practiced curve of his lips flattened into a thin, bloodless line before his jaw went slack. The healthy, tan glow of his lifestyle evaporated, leaving behind a sickly, gray pallor that made him look 10 years older in seconds. His eyes, usually bright with calculated arrogance, darted frantically toward the screen, widening until the whites were visible all the way around the irises. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline and tracked a slow, glistening path through his foundation, while his throat worked in a rhythmic, desperate swallow that produced no sound. He looked like a man watching his own execution in high definition. The room erupted. Marcus Thorne's champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot in the sudden vacuum of noise. Beatrice Thorne gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she looked from the screen to her son in dawning horror. Silas Vance stood up from his seat in the third row, his face a mask of professional vindication as he signaled to the two men in dark suits waiting by the doors. "What is this?" an investor shouted, standing up. "Julian, explain this." Julian turned to Elena, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the podium. You bitch," he hissed, the microphone catching the venom in his voice. "You ruined everything." Elena didn't flinch. She stepped closer to him, her shadow falling over his trembling form. "I didn't ruin anything, Julian. I just stopped pretending your lies were mine." She leaned in, her voice a cold whisper that only he could hear. "You said I didn't belong in this world. You were right. I don't belong in a world built on my own stolen life. I'm the majority shareholder now. And you're just a trespasser." She turned and walked off the stage, the sound of her heels a rhythmic, predatory click against the wood. She didn't look back as the investors swarmed the stage and the men Silas had brought moved in. She walked past her father's stunned silence and her mother's frantic sobbing, stepping out of the ballroom and into the cool, night air. Behind her, the Thorne Legacy was screaming as it burned. Ahead of her, for the first time in her life, was silence. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and blocked every number associated with the name Thorne. It was over. But as she reached the curb, a black sedan pulled up, and the window rolled down. Sophia Reed sat in the back, her face pale. "Elena, you need to get in. Your father. He didn't just forge the deed. There's something else in the vault." Seconds after the car door clicked shut, the interior of the black sedan swallowed the muffled chaos of the ballroom. The scent of rain-drenched asphalt and Sophia Reed's familiar, lavender-scented soap filled the cramped space. Elena Thorne didn't look back at the glass-fronted building where her life's work was currently being stripped from her family's hands. She stared at the pale, trembling woman beside her. "The vault, Sophia," she asked, her voice a low, steady hum that contrasted with the frantic drumming of rain on the roof. "I have the shares. I have the deed. What could possibly be left?" Sophia Reed didn't answer immediately. She reached into the footwell and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron key. "Your father didn't just steal the company, Elena. He stole the truth about your mother's final months. There's a ledger in the floor safe of the study. He thinks I never saw where he hid the second key." The drive to the Thorne estate took less than 10 minutes, but the silence inside the car felt like a countdown. As they pulled into the circular driveway, the headlights swept over the manicured lawn, a landscape Elena had designed and her father had claimed. The house stood like a tomb, dark except for the flickering light of the security system. They reached the study just as a second set of headlights tore through the driveway. Elena didn't rush. She knelt by the heavy mahogany desk, peeling back the corner of the Persian rug. The floor safe was an old-fashioned model, heavy and stubborn. The iron key turned with a visceral metallic groan that echoed through the empty house. Inside sat a single, leather-bound book, the something else. The front door slammed. "Elena, get away from there." Marcus Thorne's voice boomed through the hallway, stripped of its usual polished authority. He burst into the room, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with sweat and spilled wine. Behind him, Julian Thorne looked less like a businessman and more like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the open safe. "You've done enough damage," Julian snapped, stepping forward with a sneer that didn't quite hide the tremor in his jaw. "You think a few shares make you the queen? This is our home. That safe is private property. Give me the book or I'll have you removed for trespassing." Elena stood slowly, clutching the ledger to her chest. She felt the cool, embossed leather under her fingertips, the tactile weight of a decade of secrets. Trespassing. That's a bold word for a man whose name isn't on a single utility bill in this house. Marcus Thorne stood frozen, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle as if the muscles had simply given up. The ruddy, self-assured glow of a man who owned the world vanished, replaced by a gray, papery pallor that made him look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. His eyes, usually sharp with calculation, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the empty safe as his breath hitched in a series of jagged, wet rattles. The fine silk of his tie fluttered against his chest, betrayed by the violent tremor in his hands, while a single bead of sweat tracked a slow, oily path down his temple. He didn't just look defeated. He looked hollowed out, a shell of a man realizing the foundation of his entire existence had turned to dust. "You found it," he whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. "I found everything," she replied. She flipped the book open to the final page. "The medical records, the redirected insurance payouts. You didn't just forge my name on the company deeds, Marcus. You let my mother believe she was bankrupt while she was dying so you could funnel her treatment fund into Julian's failed tech startup." Beatrice Thorne appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of horrified confusion. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" "She's lying," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged toward Elena, his hand outstretched to grab the ledger. "She's always been jealous. She's trying to tear this family apart because she couldn't cut it on her own." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even move. A heavy shadow stepped from the hallway behind Beatrice, placing a firm, gloved hand on Julian's shoulder. Silas Vance looked at the younger man with the clinical detachment of a butcher. "I wouldn't do that, Julian," Silas said, his voice calm and terrifying. "The authorities are already at the gate. I've spent the last hour cross-referencing these ledger entries with the digital footprints I pulled from the Thorne server. It's not just fraud anymore. It's elder abuse and grand larceny." The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant, approaching wail of sirens. Julian's hand dropped. He looked at his father, then at his mother, but found no shelter. The new money, bravado, had evaporated, leaving behind a boy in an expensive suit who finally realized the bill had come due. Elena tucked the ledger under her arm and walked toward the door. As she passed her father, she stopped. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply leaned in close enough to smell the expensive scotch on his breath, the scent of a life built on theft. "You told me once that the Thorne name was a crown," she said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "You were wrong. It was a debt, and I've just foreclosed on the house." She walked out of the study without looking back. She passed Beatrice, who was weeping silently into her hands, and Silas, who gave her a single, respectful nod. She stepped out onto the porch just as the first blue and red lights began to dance against the white columns of the estate. The rain had turned into a soft mist. Elena reached the curb where Sophia was waiting in the sedan. She felt a strange, light sensation in her chest, the weight of the Thorne legacy finally falling away. She pulled her phone from her pocket and saw a dozen missed calls from the board members who had mocked her an hour ago. She hit clear all. "Where to, Miss Elena?" Sophia asked softly. Elena looked at the house one last time as the police officers began to ascend the steps. "Away from here, Sophia. I have a business to run tomorrow, and for the first time in my life, I don't have to share the profit with ghosts." The car pulled away, leaving the screaming sirens and the crumbling dynasty behind. The silence ahead of her wasn't empty, it was a clean slate. 6 months had passed since the rain-slicked columns of the Thorne estate had faded into the rearview mirror of a black sedan. For Elena Thorne, the interval felt like a lifetime and a single breath all at once. She stood now in the center of her new architectural firm, a glass-walled sanctuary perched 40 stories above the city's rhythmic pulse. The air here didn't smell of dust and stagnant tradition. It smelled of fresh vellum, expensive espresso, and the ozone of a coming storm. She smoothed the front of her charcoal wool trousers, the fabric heavy and impeccably tailored. There were no logos on her clothes, no flash of gold to announce her presence. She had embraced the silence of true power. On her desk lay a copy of the morning's Financial Gazette. The headline was small, tucked away in the legal notices, but it felt like a symphony. Thorne Holdings liquidation complete. Julian Thorne files for personal bankruptcy. A digital tablet beside the paper flickered with a news clip from 2 days prior. It showed a grainy image of a man standing outside a municipal courthouse. He was wearing a blazer that was 2 sizes too large, the once crisp collar frayed and yellowing. His hair, usually slicked back with expensive pomade, was wind-blown and thinning. He was clutching a plastic grocery bag, his eyes darting toward the cameras with a mixture of terror and unearned indignation. The new money, Prince was now a pauper of his own making. Without the stolen dividends and the forged signatures of his sister, his lifestyle had collapsed like a house of cards in a gale. The door to the studio opened with a soft chime. Silas Vance stepped inside, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He carried a single, slim folder. "The final transfer went through this morning," he said, his voice low and steady. "The estate has a new owner, a historical preservation group. They're turning the grounds into a public park." Elena took the folder, her fingers grazing the cool, embossed leather. "And the others?" "Your father is nearing the end of his first trimester in the minimum security facility," he replied, leaning against the edge of a drafting table. "He's reportedly working in the library. He doesn't take visitors, not even your mother." Beatrice Thorne was a different story. Elena thought of the voicemail she had received just last night, the third one this week. Her mother's voice had been thin, brittle as dried parchment, complaining about the draftiness of her 2-bedroom rental and the utter rudeness of the local grocer who didn't recognize her name. She had asked for an allowance, a small gesture of filial piety. Elena had deleted the message without finishing it. The woman who had viewed her daughter as a utility was finally learning the cost of her own inventory. "Sophia Reed called me this morning," Silas added, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She's settled into that cottage in the valley. She said the silence there is the kind you can actually sleep in." Elena nodded, a tightness in her chest loosening. "She earned that silence more than any of us." She walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling grid of the city. She had won. The architects of her misery were dismantled, their reputations stripped, and their bank accounts emptied. She had her firm, her integrity, and a fortune that no longer felt like blood money. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, the victory felt heavy. She thought of the empty hallways of her childhood, the Christmas dinners that were really just board meetings in disguise, and the sisterly love she had tried so hard to find in a brother who only saw her as a ledger. She had cut out the cancer, but the scars remained, thick and silver against her soul. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. There was no one left to call for a celebration, no family to share the triumph with, only the ghosts of the people they were supposed to be. She had traded a dynasty for a clean slate, and for the first time, she realized how cold a clean slate could be. She turned off the lights of her office, the glass reflecting her solitary silhouette. She picked up her keys, the cold metal biting into her palm. She had spent her life trying to belong in a house that hated her, only to realize that the only home worth having was the one she built from the wreckage. She stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a hushed, final click. As the car descended, she let out a long, slow breath. The Thorne legacy was dead. Elena was finally alone, and for the first time in 30 years, she was exactly where she wanted to be.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.